All right, so thank you all for coming, and thanks to Colin for this excellent conference, hosting this excellent conference, and to Dai for organizing all this. There's a full version of the paper that's forthcoming in History of Modern Philosophy. If you're interested in the full paper, I'm happy to share it with you. The paper contains a lot more textual analysis of the relevant texts that I'm going to mention, but I'm not going to go into the details of the texts. And I just want to give you a bigger picture and give you occasion to think through some of the issues. And also, this is the beginning of my next book project, where I intend to examine Kant's political theory broadly construed, to include not just the doctrine of right, but also Kant's political economy and Kant's political geography and all this kind of stuff, against the very backdrop of colonial slavery. So the new book project is entitled, tentatively entitled, Colonial Slavery and Kant's Political Thought of Kant's Political Theory. Like Laura, I just got interested in Kant's political philosophy, and so this has been really interesting journey for me. I really look forward to how you react to my talk. So let's just begin with where the scholarship on Kant's views on slavery is. In Kant's scholarship, at least, there is very little that has been written about slavery, and there's very little attention paid to slavery, even though I think Kant has a lot to say about slavery and did say quite a bit about slavery, different forms of slavery. And typically, if you're a Kant scholar, you think about slavery, you go to this article by Huaping Lu-Adler, who embedded some remarks about Kant's views on slavery in this context of trying to show that Kant had second thoughts about race. And so in this talk, I actually want to tease apart Kant's views on race and Kant's views on slavery. And I want to set aside what Kant says about race, and I just want to focus on his political theory. My intention is to see how far I can go without ever mentioning Kant's views on race. We'll see how whether I'm going to be successful. But anyhow, Huaping Lu-Adler claims that Kant late in his life unambiguously, categorically, and repeatedly condemned chattel slavery, which I will call colonial slavery, in mid to late 1790s. And Lu-Adler relied on three sets of texts. First is Kant's preparatory drafts for the Perpetual Peace essay, and then second, published version of Perpetual Peace, and lastly, the Metaphysics of Morals, especially the Doctrine of Right. So I have already argued in an earlier paper called Kant on Slavery, why he never became racial egalitarian. In that text, in that paper, I did say quite a bit about Kant's views on race. So there, what's relevant to my talk is that there are already argued that there is no clear textual evidence that Kant categorically condemned colonial slavery as an institution. So I want to emphasize here, as an institution. So Kant did say something critically about the practices of slavery, but I want to emphasize the fact that colonial slavery was an institution. So what are the relevant features of an institution? First of all, colonial slavery was organized in that it involved collective and coordinated actions of relevant stakeholders. And second, it had an established structure in the sense that each of those stakeholders played a determinate role that served to sustain the structure. For example, as a slaveholder, slave trader, or investor in the slave trade. And it was also embedded within a larger system in a way that was linked up with other institutions, such as banks. So if you read History of Slavery, you probably heard a lot about how banks were involved in slave trade, and a lot of banks still owe quite a bit to us, to people who were enslaved. And last but not least, but this is also the part that's also particularly relevant to my interpretation of Kant's approach to slavery. it was regulated by legal codes as well as shared practical norms. These together gave colonial slavery the appearance of legitimacy and ensure its sustainability by, for example, preventing self-undermining ways of using slaves. In this regard, Edmund Burke's 1780 sketch of the Negro Codes made it really clear that he was trying to convince the British government to regulate slavery, so that it did not look as problematic as it should. So anyhow, as did. So unlike many other well-known Enlightenment thinkers such as Montesquieu, Adam Smith, and Edmund Burke, Kant really never theorized about colonial slavery as an institution. And he apparently did not see colonial slavery as an urgent issue to address. And I also want to point out that I don't want to say that Kant endorsed colonial slavery on moral grounds. I actually grant to Kant that he might think, from a moral standpoint, he might say slavery was evil. But that's separate from whether he would call for its abolition. So basically what I'm teasing apart here is that the morality of slavery on the one hand, the other was the practical issue of whether to abolish slavery. I think abolition is more than just a moral issue, but rather it's a political issue. And often there were people who say that slavery was wrong, morally speaking, but then they would be against abolition, and at least against immediate abolition. And they would do so out of pragmatic, political, and or economic reasons. And you can see that in Edmund Burke again pretty clearly. So now I want to think in this talk today, I want to think about why Kant was normatively silent about the abolitionist movement. And he never, for one, never unambiguously said that slavery was morally wrong. But again, I would give it to him that slavery was morally wrong. But one thing that's particularly clear was that he never called for the abolition of slavery. And so my suspicion right now is that even if Kant finds the institution of colonial slavery morally objectionable, he would still find it theoretically difficult to prescribe its abolition. And this theoretical difficulty probably came from certain limitations of his political philosophy, and especially his conception of right. I want to focus on this telling fact about late Kant, late Kant meaning the Kant in the 1790s, especially mid to late 1790s. So Kant referred to various forms of slavery several times, especially in the Doctrine of Right, and have had opportunities for that reason to argue that colonial slavery violated the right of the enslaved humans, but he didn't. Why not? And my suspicion is that it's not just about race. Maybe there's something about race there, but I want to say it's not just about race, but rather his theory may not be stronger than his racist prejudices. So here, to people who are familiar with the literature, people can tell I'm responding to this assumption that Kant's theory is stronger than his prejudices. And I don't want people to take for granted that his theory is stronger than his prejudices. That's also why I'm not talking about his racism. I just want to talk about theory and to see whether his theory really even contains any good potential for abolitionist cause. Okay, here's my plan. First of all, I want to look at this French abolitionist thinker, Louis de Yacour's encyclopedia entries on slavery in 1755 and on slave trade in 1765. what it looked like in Kant's time to use the language of natural right to condemn colonial slavery and demand abolition. Second, and then I look at what Kant said by contrast. And what Kant said would point to fairly conventional view about civil slavery, but no condemnation of colonial slavery as an institution, let alone call for its abolition. And the last bit of my talk is going to look at how Kant's theory of right might have got in the way. And so let's first take a look at what Louis de Jaucourt said about slave trade, or what he called the trade of human beings, as if they were merchandise. Louis de Jaucourt argued that slave trade is wrong in every way. First of all, it violates all religion, morals, natural law, and human rights. And if the slaves were sold by their rulers, Louis de Jaucourt argues, everyone should know that rulers are not owners of their subjects, and nobody has the right to buy these subjects or call himself their master. And human beings are not objects of commerce, and so can never be bought at any price. And so that was a Louis de Jaucourt. And now let's say what Kant, when he did have an opportunity to comment, is at least implicitly on slave trade, and see what he said. So there is this section, really peculiar section called "What is Money" in the Doctrine of Right. And there Kant gave a bunch of examples of things that became money. And one of the examples he gave were Black slaves on the coast of Guinea, which he elsewhere referred to as the slave coast, according to the convention at the time. He treated these Black slaves as an example of goods that eventually became money, or a lawful means of exchange of the industry of subjects with one another. They are the kind of goods that if one individual shows a demand for it, this demand will move another individual to industry in procuring it. In this way, Kant actually captured the demand and supply logic of slave trade quite well. Basically, the demand for slave labor on the colonies were what drove slave trade. And Kant's contemporaries were pretty clear about this connection between the practice on the colonies and slave trade itself. And so one might push back and say, like, well, but Kant was just describing, what was common practice at the time, and how slaves were treated, and how slaves became received the status of money, just like gold, for example. And my mom might say, Kant was just describing all this situation. He was not endorsing it. I grant it. But here in this context, I don't think there is any morally innocent description of slave trade in this context, especially as it is embedded in the text, like the Doctrine of Right. So let's now turn to see what Louis de Jaucourt said about Atlantic slavery. Slavery is wrong, Louis de Jaucourt argues. A Negro sold into slavery did not and could never lose his innate freedom or natural rights, but carries it everywhere. This licenses him to demand that he be allowed to enjoy it wherever he goes, and gives him the right to be declared free. This right has absolute precedence over civil laws, because Louis de Jaucourt was writing at the time when, of course, slave trade and slavery were legal. So Louis de Jaucourt wants to say, like, even if there are laws, right, civil laws licensing slave trade and slavery, that does not make them right. So he'll say, can one raise the question of whether a judge is more obliged to observe the natural laws of equity than to respect the arbitrary and inhumane customs of colonies. Okay, so and Louis Delacour was also aware of the argument that even if slavery was wrong, it should not be abolished because it would be so destructive. And Louis Delacour's response to that kind of argument would be like, so be it, right? He would say, European colonies deserve to be destroyed. It's preposterous to think that the Negro population should be horribly wronged for us to enrich ourselves or provide for our luxury. Now let's say let's turn to Kant and to see what he said or didn't say about slavery in the Doctrine of Right. So let me just begin by looking at Kant's theory. So often people who, if you are a Kant scholar and you want to see whether the Doctrine of Right contains any theoretical potential to support abolitionist cause, you want to see what kind of conceptual tools Kant might give us, like what Kantian tools we might be able to find in order to kind of support abolitionist demand, right? So a natural place to go would be his view of innate right. And so the question is, does Kant's notion of innate right have abolitionist potential? This is a question I want to consider. The innate right to freedom, according to Kant, belongs to everyone by nature. He says, freedom, namely independence from being constrained by another's necessitating power of choice, insofar as it can coexist with the freedom of every other in accordance with the universal law, is the only original right belonging to every man by virtue of his humanity. That sounds pretty promising, right? Okay, and then next he says, innate freedom entails innate equality, on account of which one is one's own master and cannot be bound by others to more than one can in turn bind them. So the question is, does one carry this? The important question here is whether one carries this natural right everywhere, as Louis Delacour argued, including after one is already sold into slavery. Another question is, does its claim, namely the claim of innate right, have absolute power over civil or positive public laws? And then another set of questions are like this: does colonial slavery violate the enslaved people's innate right to freedom? If yes, do they have the right to demand liberation? Namely, do they have the right to demand the abolition of colonial slavery? The answers to these questions may vary from each other, so I don't intend to fully answer all four questions I'm raising here. And there are also like additional questions as to, sorry, this is another question. So I don't intend to answer all these questions I raised here, but I do intend to point to a direction where the Kant's theory of innate right does not really give us any clear like license, so to speak, to demand abolition and to support abolition, for example. So I want to look at how a liberal reading of Kant's theory of innate right looks like. So a liberal reading from now is such that Kant's answer in principle to those questions would be yes, even if he himself did not give a positive answer, at least not explicitly. In other words, at least his theory entails abolitionist demands. So that's what a liberal reading of Kant would give us. And my response would be, do not take that for granted. And you might be right, but I don't think anyone should take for granted that Kant's theory of innate right contains in itself abolitionist potential. So for that, I need to kind of take a detour with me into Kant's theory of innateness. And this model of innateness, by the way, was fully articulated in Kant's 3 essays on race, right? Kant wrote 3 essays on race where he fully articulated this kind of model for thinking about innateness. And we can situate Kant in the early modern debate about innateness. So in general, when Kant talks about what is innate, he often uses dispositional language, right? He usually would think that what is innate is posited as so-called germs and natural predispositions, right? Just here you get, a kernel of seed and has certain germs of predispositions in it that would allow it to develop into some mature plant, for example. Because these are only germs and predispositions, they need to be developed under certain material conditions. And for example, and there are a lot of examples in the familiar parts of Kant's system. So for example, he talks about categories or pure concepts of the understanding. There was this debate, right, early modern debate about whether you can have whether the pure concepts of understanding, such as cause, are innate. And Kant actually has a very interesting take on that. He'll say, as representations, they are not innate, but the grounds for the acquisition of these pure concepts are innate. So here's what he said in the first critique. He said, we must pursue these concepts into their first germs and predispositions in the human understanding where they lie ready until with the occasion of experience, they're fully developed and exhibited in their clarity by the very same understanding. And then morality also provides another example. So when Kant talks about morality, he often gives us this developmental picture, and he would posit germs for morality. He said, here's the one passage. He says, innate to the human nature are germs which develop and can achieve the perfection for which they are determined. A savage Indian or Greenlander has the same germs as a civilized human being, only they are not yet developed. And this passage is really relevant here. So basically what Kant is saying is that in the case of humanity, morality, we, all human beings, insofar as we belong to the same human species, we have the same original moral germs. But civil condition alone makes all the difference. Namely, those moral germs have to be developed in civil condition. This qualification will become really, really important in the rest of my talk. So likewise, a system right can be developed and secured and enjoyed only in civil condition. And Kant actually gives an argument to this effect in the Doctrine of Right. So, in the Doctrine of Right, Kant makes this distinction between two kinds of states. One is state of nature, the other is the civil state. And overall, he keeps arguing emphatically that we have obligation to leave state of nature to enter civil state, right? Because he thinks that state of nature is not rightful. He says, state of nature is devoid of justice. No one is assured of what is his against violence. And he who seeks to lord over others as their master does not thereby wrong them, right? Because the question of justice just does not arise in this particular context, in the context of state of nature. By contrast, civil condition alone is a rightful condition under an authority giving laws publicly, and it secures what is mine and yours by public law, and it contains the conditions under which alone everybody is able to enjoy his rights. Kant actually emphasized, that was his original emphasis, enjoy his rights. It's not enough to say that you have rights, but what's important here is under what conditions you can enjoy your right. So gets to what Kant says about right in the Doctrine of Right. So basically, when Kant talks about right, in most of the doctrine of right is right in a civil state. Because again, as I mentioned, for him, the state of nature is not a rightful state. So whenever he talks about right, he's really only talking about right in the civil state. Right in the civil state, according to Kant, consists in a reciprocal relation of free choice between human beings who are free to begin with. And this is a really important bit of qualification. So when you talk about right in a civil condition, you basically are operating with this presupposition of civil personality. The doctrine of right only concerns the relation of human beings to human beings equally considered as persons who have rights as well as duties. And in a way, there is this kind of what we might call citizenship condition here. In the civil state, a human being at least has the dignity of a citizen, Kant says, which he can only lose by his own crime. And so this takes us to what Kant says about two forms of civil slavery. One is penal slavery, or slavery through liability. So that was already indicated when he says you can lose this kind of dignity of a citizen only by your own crime. So this he is thereby leading to his endorsement of penal slavery. He says, by committing a crime that's not punishable by death, one loses his civil personality and is reduced to a literal slave by a verdict and right. And he thereby becomes another's property and can be used as a thing. And this is literally what Kant is saying about anyone who committed a crime and become, a prison, so to speak, to the state. So there's endorses penal slavery, and on the other hand, he also rejects so-called contractual self-enslavement. He thinks that contractual self-enslavement is impossible in that one can, in the following sense, one can make a contract only as a person, but one ceases to be a person if one turns oneself into another's property or a mere thing by contract. And this amounts to the impossible act of self-cancellation. So that's why Kant thinks that contractual voluntary self-enslavement is impossible. So that pair of propositions, that is, there can be rightful penal slavery, but there's no legitimate self-enslavement. This pair of propositions makes sense only on the presupposition of civil personality. This again takes us to the citizenship condition. So that qualification raises the specter that whatever Kant was saying about right here is inapplicable, and whatever he's saying about slavery here, civil slavery in this context is inapplicable to colonial slavery, because the enslaved are civically unenfranchised, and they are not free citizens of a state, but have the legal status as somebody else's property. And this property right is furthermore sanctioned by the state. And so, and this kind of, points back to what I said earlier about the status of colonial slavery as an institution. So in that sense, slaves at the time are what Kant would call civil non-beings, except as somebody else's property. So I got this notion of civil non-being from what Kant said about infanticide. And there was this, of course, I want to acknowledge that what Kant said about infanticide is very controversial, and interpreters interpret it differently. So all I want to say, like in this case, so Kant was basically thinking about a child being born out of the wedlock, and back then women would kill their infants to preserve their honor and things like that, right? So Kant finds that kind of case really interesting, and raises some kind of paradox for the state. So, but for the purpose of my talk, I'll just say what he said about the so-called illicit child. is that the illicit child has, as it were, stolen into the commonwealth like a contraband merchandise, so that the commonwealth can ignore its existence, since it was not right that should have come into existence in this way, and can therefore also ignore its annihilation. So, in other words, a child who was born out of the wedlock has the status of a civil non-being. And slaves, analogously, are like civil non-beings, except as properties in the eye of a civil European state. For that reason, they have no legally protected right as persons. So this kind of explains why Kant claims that there is no place for, suggests that there is no place for them in a system right. So he gives this kind of division of a system of right, and one category includes the beings who have no personality, and these beings would be serfs and slaves. So Pauline Kleingeld interprets this as Kant arguing against slavery, but I think that inference doesn't go through, because another way of making sense of it is to say that his system right simply does not apply to human beings who have the status of slavery. So, in other words, there is no place for them in Kant's system of right, not because colonial slavery is wrong, again, but because the concept of right as reciprocal relation between presumptively free human beings is inapplicable in this case. And so this also probably explains Kant's continued normative practice, normative silences about what to do about colonial slavery. For example, he never asked whether colonial states ought to abolish it, as some of his contemporaries argued, or whether free citizens in a colonial state are culpably implicated due to material entanglement and bear the burden to see to its abolition, as some of Kant's contemporaries also argued, or whether slaves on the so-called West Indian sugar plantations or sugar islands were entitled to rise against it, for example, as the slaves did during the Haitian Revolution, which, by the way, was going on as Kant was writing the Doctrine, right? Okay, so Kant was silenced about all these things. He never seemed to take any interest in any of these questions, even as he wrote so systematically about right. Okay, so to kind of bring everything together, just to recall what I did in this talk. So I talked about Louis de Jaucourt's categorical objections to colonial slavery, and I pointed out that Louis de Jaucourt's objections seem to rest on the views that, first of all, every single human being has an original and inalienable right to freedom. Secondly, one carries this right everywhere. Lastly, it has absolute precedence over positive civil laws. And on those grounds, Louis de Jaucourt argued that colonial slavery as an institution is unjust vis-a-vis the natural laws of equity, and any positive laws that sanction it are therefore invalid. And enslaved people have the right to demand liberation, which would entail immediate and total abolition of colonial slavery at all costs, even if it meant destruction of all the colonies. Okay, by contrast, I'm not sure. So even though Kant would say in abstraction, every human being, qua human being, has innate right to freedom. But what is unclear is whether everyone can enjoy this right everywhere under all conditions, and hence whether it is absolutely inviolable and takes precedence over any positive law that comes into conflict with it. So, and I think Kant's emphasis on civil condition as the only rightful condition makes all the difference here. It's difficult to see, as far as I can tell, on what Kantian grounds colonial slaves who are not free members of a state, a civil state to begin with, can demand the protection of their freedom from the infringement of others. It's not enough simply to invoke something like the categorical imperative, because the very relationship between abstract moral principles and concrete political conditions is in question here. Here, I think this kind of dovetails with Laura's talk really well, right? This really raises the question about the relationship between morality and politics in Kant's system. And Kant will say, law-governed political states constitute a necessary precondition, which for Kant is civil condition, for the eventual moralization of humanity. And Kant actually might find the abolition of colonial slavery as a state-sanctioned and structurally entrenched institution all too destabilizing and all too destructive for European civil states. And so in this case, actually, Kant, if this is what Kant would say if you press him on this topic, he was actually pretty close to what a lot of other Enlightenment thinkers were worried about. So, for example, Adam Smith was very pessimistic about the possibility of abolition, even though Adam Smith thought, like, if you just follow your reason, slavery should not be here, should be gone, right? But because of all the economic entanglement, Adam Smith was very pessimistic about whether it's practically possible to abolish slavery, at least not peacefully. And Edmund Burke makes a similar argument, even though I find Adam Smith's pessimism actually a little bit more palatable than Edmund Burke's way of arguing things. But nevertheless, I think there was this shared anxiety about the destabilizing effect of abolition on the states. And some people think, depending on how you think about Kant's view on states, given how much he cared about there being a civil condition, some may read him as kind of having a kind of state fetishism. And he basically thinks that state should be preserved even when it morally antagonizes us, right? And morally speaking, it licenses all sorts of practices that violate our moral sensibility. And Kant would say, like, just be patient. We're going to eventually get there, right? To moralization. We're just not quite there yet, but now we have to go through all the hardships, right? And then like, okay, easy for you to say, okay, anyhow, so I think in a word, what this reflection on his views on his normative silence is about colonial slavery is making me think is what's really the force of Kant's lofty, abstract, moral idea vis-a-vis political realities, given his state fetishism, if I may call it that. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm curious to see what you all have to say. Thank you so much.